Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, June 6th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Hamas reiterates call for permanent ceasefire. So the head of Hamas's political bureau, Ismail Haniyeh, reaffirmed on Wednesday the Palestinian group's condition of a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza for any hostage deal with Israel. So Haniyeh said, quote, "The movement and factions of the resistance will deal seriously and positively with any agreement that is based on a comprehensive ending of the aggression and the complete withdrawal and prisoners swap," end quote. So far, Hamas has not given its official response to this proposal that they've been looking at. And this was what was presented by President Biden. There's some reports saying Hamas wants stronger guarantees for the ceasefire, which is kind of the whole problem here. You had Biden present this ceasefire proposal, and the basics of it is that the first phase is a 6-week ceasefire and initial hostage and prisoner exchange. And then during that time, they're supposed to negotiate the permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal. And Israeli officials say that the language is vague enough that Israel could agree to the deal without actually committing to a permanent ceasefire. But Netanyahu continues to say he's against a permanent ceasefire. And Israeli officials say that's probably going to sabotage the deal because now Hamas is looking for stronger guarantees. So the U.S. is still pushing for this. CIA Director William Burns is expected to meet with Egyptian and Qatari officials about it this week. Meanwhile, the Israeli military operations continue in Gaza. They continue to slaughter Palestinians across the Gaza Strip. Israel has significantly escalated, it looks like, operations in the central part of Gaza. Al Jazeera reported on Wednesday that 75 Palestinians were killed in central Gaza over the previous 24 hours. And I saw lots of videos and images of dead children, just as horrific as ever. An Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, reiterated on Wednesday that Israel would not halt its military operations to foster negotiations. He said, quote, "Any negotiations with Hamas would be conducted only under fire," end quote. So it's been over 8 months, or is it going to be 8 months on the 7th? 8 months of this thing, just horrific. All right, so the next one here, the State Department touts collective punishment as leverage with Hamas. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and it's kind of an analysis of comments from the State Department and how they're essentially saying, well, Hamas has to accept this deal because if they don't, Palestinian people will keep dying. They're kind of using collective punishment of the Palestinians in Gaza as leverage for the negotiations. So in several exchanges with reporters this week, U.S. State Department spokesperson Matt Miller called on Hamas to end the suffering and deaths of innocent Palestinians in the war on Gaza by accepting a ceasefire in remarks that have been criticized as leveraging collective punishment against a Palestinian group. On Tuesday, Miller was asked during a press briefing about the terms of the latest ceasefire proposal and why Hamas would accept an agreement that would see the dissolution of the group itself. Miller responded, quote, "Because they don't want to see the continued conflict, continued Palestinian people dying. They don't want to see war in Gaza," end quote. So the comments by Miller were criticized by legal experts who say that Washington was admitting to using collective punishment of Palestinian civilians as a bargaining chip against Hamas leadership, which of course they are. I mean, it's obvious to everybody, but it's interesting to see these comments kind of analyzed. So then on Wednesday, the issue was brought up again during a State Department press briefing. Tom Bateman, a correspondent for the BBC, asked Miller, quote, "You say that Hamas and Sinwar should bear in mind that we should draw them to a ceasefire is that Palestinian people are being killed. But your position is that no Palestinian civilians should be killed. So why do you raise that point as a point of pressure on Hamas?" End quote. And Miller said, His response was that it's a point of actual fact, the fact that Palestinians are going to keep dying. So the exchange continued, and Bateman said, quote, "It just feels rather contradictory if your position is that Palestinian civilians should not be killed to raise that as a specific point of pressure on Hamas to come to a ceasefire," end quote. And really, this just goes to show the hypocrisy, the blatant hypocrisy, in the U.S. position here. I mean, this claim that they care about Palestinian civilians while backing Israel as it continues to bomb and starve them. I mean, it's just not reality based. And the contradiction can be seen here. And then this just goes into kind of the details about where we're at with the hostage deal. But I just thought that was interesting. All right, so the next one here, Israel secretly targets U.S. lawmakers with influence campaign. So this article is from the New York Times, and it's interesting. All the talk you hear about election interference. So Israel organized and paid for an influence campaign last year targeting U.S. lawmakers and the American public with pro-Israel messaging as it aimed to foster support for its actions in the war with Gaza, according to officials involved in the effort and documents related to the operation. Interesting, they call it the war with Gaza, it's a war on Gaza. The covert campaign was commissioned by Israel's Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, a government body that connects Jews around the world with the state of Israel, 4 Israeli officials said. The ministry allocated about $2 million to the operation and hired Stoic, a political marketing firm in Tel Aviv, to carry it out, according to the officials in the documents. The campaign began in October and remains active on the platform X. So they're saying this influence campaign continues. And I mean, this isn't a surprise. But these details are interesting. At its peak, it used hundreds of fake accounts that posed as real Americans on X, Facebook, and Instagram to post pro-Israel comments. The accounts focused on U.S. lawmakers, particularly ones who are black, and Democrats, such as Representative Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader from New York, and Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia, with posts urging them to continue funding Israel's military. So it's interesting that they're saying they specifically targeted black Democrats. ChatGPT, the artificial intelligence-powered chatbot, was used to generate many of the posts. The campaign also created 3 fake English language news sites featuring pro-Israel articles. The Israeli government's connection to the influence operation, which the New York Times verified with 4 current and former members of the Israeli ministry, and documents about the campaign, has not been previously reported. Fake Reporter, an Israeli misinformation watchdog, identified the effort in March. Last week, Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, and OpenAI, I didn't know they owned OpenAI. Oh, actually, yeah, I did know that. Sorry. So that's what makes ChatGPT. They said they have also found and disrupted the operation. The secretive campaign signals the lengths Israel was willing to go to sway American opinion on the war in Gaza. The United States has long been one of Israel's staunchest allies, as we all know this stuff, but definitely some interesting stuff here. And confirmation, they're saying, from Israeli government sources, who are involved in it. And I'm sure this type of online psyops just go so far beyond what we are aware of. I know that the Pentagon, the U.S. military, has been caught doing stuff like this, like accounts in targeting people in like Yemen, saying how great the Americans are and how bad the Houthis are, like things like that. There's a lot of psyops that the U.S. military does like that as well. And I know says they targeted Richie Torres, and he's one of the most pro-Israel Democrats I've ever seen. So he blocked me on Twitter, actually. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu says that Israel is ready for an intense Lebanon war. So this article is from Jason Ditz, and Netanyahu is talking up Israeli residents for a war with Lebanon. Following a war cabinet meeting, Netanyahu declared on Wednesday that Israel is prepared for a very intense operation against Lebanon, asserting that he would restore calm to the north of Israel one way or another. For 8 months, Israel and Hezbollah have been trading near daily fire across the border, and Israeli politicians have demanded a resolution as tens of thousands of civilians are being displaced by this military action. And war has been anticipated all year, but the starting point has moved closer, with Israeli Army Chief Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi reiterating that Israel is ready for an offensive and that a decision point is at hand. Lebanon's Prime Minister Nijab Mikati, he is downplaying the risk, saying that reports of an imminent war are baseless, but we've seen just a lot of rhetoric from the Israelis and a real increase in the airstrikes and Hezbollah attacks on northern Israel. Everything seems to be ramping up. And Israel continued its attacks on southern Lebanon, killing at least 2 people on motorcycles. They've been targeting a lot of people on motorcycles, and the slain were reported as Hezbollah members, and something like over 400 people have been killed in Lebanon since October 7th by this Israeli bombing campaign, including around 80 civilians. All right, so the next one here, the IRGC vows revenge for Israel killing Iran military advisor in Syria. So the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps vowed on Wednesday that Israel will pay for killing an Iranian military advisor in Syria in strikes that hit targets north of Aleppo on Monday night. So this is confirmation that Israel did kill an Iranian military advisor. Iranian media reported that IRGC advisor Saeed Abiyar was killed in the strikes, marking the first Iranian killed by Israel since the April 1st Israeli bombing of Iran's consulate in Damascus. So this is Major General Hossein Salami. He is the head of the IRGC. He said, quote, "The child-killing Zionist criminals should know that they will pay for the innocent blood that was shed in this crime. They should wait for the response," end quote. So this has been the big question, and I know it's something I've discussed here, is that Israel has a long history of killing Iranians in Syria, of conducting covert assassinations and stuff inside Iran. And Iran's response is usually very restrained if they respond at all. But after that April 1st consulate bombing, which was a huge escalation, a brazen bombing of a diplomatic facility in the middle of the day, Iran responded and they fired missiles and drones at Israeli territory for the first time. So the question is now, did they try to establish something that they, will they respond to this? I mean, is the question. Are they going to respond when Israel kills the lower level Iranian military advisors now? IRGC, they make threats a lot, but this just goes to show that they're not downplaying it, him coming out and making this threat. So we'll see. Maybe they'll respond in some other way, quieter way. All right, so the next one here, Lebanon, Israel's use of white phosphorus risks civilian harm. So this is just a report from Human Rights Watch about Israel's widespread use of white phosphorus in South Lebanon. They're saying that it's putting civilians at grave risk and contributing to civilian displacement. Human Rights Watch verified the use of white phosphorus munitions by Israeli forces in at least 17 municipalities across South Lebanon since October 23rd, including 5 municipalities where airburst munitions were unlawfully used over populated residential areas. And I know some of this white phosphorus, the U.S. has given Israel. And the way it is classified, under the law, it's unlawful if it's used in populated areas, and you can't use it as like a weapon. They could use it to like illuminate things at night and for marking things, but you're not supposed to use it as a weapon. That makes its use illegal, and it burns the skin. It can burn the skin like right to the bone. It's a really nasty thing that Israel has been using quite a bit in southern Lebanon. All right, so the next one here, Syrian attacked the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in support of Gaza. So this article is from the New Arab. So a Syrian man was arrested after a shooting near the U.S. Embassy in Beirut on Wednesday, and a judicial official said the assailant carried out the attack in support of Gaza. So maybe a minor incident, a shooting at an embassy that there was no casualties or anything, but here you have someone saying that they attempted at least to attack the U.S. Embassy in support of Gaza, which means in response to the U.S. support for Israel. And it's not surprising to see things like this. It's another reason why the U.S. should not be supporting this genocidal war in Israel. There's many reasons, but one is that it is turning a lot of people against the U.S. And we could see more incidents like this, attacks on embassies or on civilian or military personnel in other countries as a result of backing Israel in this horrific thing. All right, so the next one here, Israeli ministers call for escalation at provocative flag march. So this is, of course, the two guys that we talk about quite a bit. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir both called for Israel to escalate in Gaza and to invade southern Lebanon on Wednesday. And these were speeches that they delivered during the provocative flag march in the old city of Jerusalem that commemorates what they call Jerusalem Day. And that is the celebration of the Israeli capture of East Jerusalem in the 1967 war. And what this flag march involves is thousands and thousands of Israelis, of ultra-nationalist Israelis, marching through the old city with their Israeli flags and chanting things, like death to Arabs. That's something that they always chant. Muhammad is dead was another chant that I saw from the march. Really provocative things like that. And, they're marching through Palestinian neighborhoods. And there's always usually violence. They attacked several Palestinians during the march. They also attacked a journalist for Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, who I believe is a Palestinian, but who works for Haaretz. We have a story on that we'll get to, but just a very provocative march. And I mentioned this a little yesterday. Ben-Gvir, this is like always considered the most extreme, the fringest of the fringe Israeli settlers. But here you have two Israeli ministers in very high-level positions, very powerful positions, attending this and delivering speeches. So during his speech, Ben-Gvir led the crowd in a chant of victory and said Israel could only win once it enters all of Gaza and fights until victory. He also says that Israel needs to go into the north and destroy Hezbollah. Smotrich called on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to give the order to go to war with Hezbollah. He said, quote, "Let our heroic warriors win, restore our national honor, national pride and security, and allow the heroic residents to return home safely," end quote. And then I just mentioned that Netanyahu did say on Wednesday that they're prepared for a very intense operation along the northern border. Ben-Gvir also declared on Wednesday that his policy was that Jews could pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, known as the Temple Mount to the Israelis, whenever they want, which goes against the status quo at the compound. So these are kind of a long quote from Ben-Gvir here, but again, this is such a sensitive subject, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the status quo is that they, Jews can't just go there and pray and do things, and a lot of times they storm the temple, storm the mosque, which is something that happened during this flag march. And Ben-Gvir said that he was, quote, "pleased that Jews went to the Temple Mount and prayed there today. This was very important. My policy is very clear on this matter. Jews can go everywhere in Jerusalem and pray anywhere and not silently. Jews prayed on the Temple Mount. That is the minister's policy. Jews prayed on the Temple Mount, and that is good," end quote. Later in the day, Ben-Gvir reiterated his position. He said, quote, "I came back here to send a message to Hamas in every house in Gaza and the north. Jerusalem is ours. Damascus Gate is ours. The Temple Mount is ours. Today, per my policy, Jews freely entered the old city, and Jews freely prayed on the Temple Mount. We say this as simply as we can. It's ours," end quote. So, this is really provocative stuff. And this is the Israeli minister in charge of security at Al-Aqsa. And according to Haaretz, this is the first time that a minister in that position has said something like that goes against the status quo. Netanyahu actually pushed back on Ben-Gvir's comments that said the status quo regarding the Temple Mount has not and will not change. So again, just all around here, very, very provocative stuff. And then the next one here, a little more about the march. Far-right Israelis attack journalists and Palestinians at flag march. This article is from Middle East Eye. And this is really just about the violence that they attacked journalists and Palestinian shop owners as they marched through. And these are young Israelis. Some of these look like kids, teenagers. And settlers threw stones and bottles at the Palestinians and chanted inflammatory slogans, including "Death to Arabs" and "Muhammad is dead." Haaretz journalist Nir Hasson was knocked to the ground and kicked by Israeli youths before police officers intervened. Several videographers were also attacked as Israeli youths attempted to violently prevent reporters from filming them. A Palestinian photographer was wounded. 5 people were arrested for attacking journalists, according to Israeli police. So far-right Israelis belonging to a group called Humanitarian Guard led the attacks on journalists and activists and also wreaked havoc inside Palestinian shops in the old city, according to Haaretz. And then the police ended up just making the Palestinians close their shops. And hundreds of Israelis stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque under heavy protection from the Israeli police. That's the thing is, they are backed by the police with all this stuff. Even though a few of them got arrested, only 5 people got arrested, considering the violence and the provocations that were happening. It's not much. All right, so the next story here. Senator confirms strikes on Russia using U.S. weapons. So Senator Mike Rounds, he's a Republican from South Dakota and a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, confirmed to the Associated Press on Wednesday that Ukraine has used U.S.-provided weapons to carry out strikes on Russian territory, which, of course, risks a major response from Russia. The report also cited an unnamed Western official who said that Ukraine used U.S. weapons on Russian territory. The report did not specify what types of weapons were used, but it came after a Ukrainian lawmaker claimed that U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems destroyed Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense missiles inside Russia's Belgorod Oblast. And then there was another report in the Wall Street Journal that cited a Ukrainian official who also said it was the HIMARS rocket launchers that were used. And the HIMARS systems require U.S. intelligence for targeting. This means that the U.S. is directly supporting missile strikes on Russian territory. And there's been no official confirmation from Russia about the strikes from what I've seen, just perusing Russian media as far as I do, which isn't, I don't go too deep into it. I usually just check the English language stuff like TASS and RT and RIA and a few other like of those news agencies. I haven't seen them mention it. But Putin issued a fresh warning to the U.S. and other NATO countries about the use of their weapons on Russian territory. This was on Wednesday. He said, quote, "If someone thinks it is possible to supply such weapons to a war zone to attack our territory and create problems for us, why don't we have the right to supply weapons of the same class to regions of the world where there will be strikes on sensitive facilities of those Western countries? That is, the response can be asymmetric. We will think about it," end quote. So he's saying they could potentially arm people that could hit Western countries as a response. Putin has previously warned of serious consequences for any NATO countries that support Ukrainian strikes on Russian territories, but if NATO, the U.S., they're not listening. They're shrugging everything off. We don't need to worry about that. It's just the Ukrainians that are going to be killed over this. But more confirmation of these strikes. It's just really unbelievable that we've gotten to this point in this proxy war. All right, so the next one here. The U.S. says that dual citizens will be stuck in Ukraine under the new mobilization law. So on Tuesday, the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine issued a warning to U.S.-Ukrainian dual citizens that they may no longer be able to leave Ukraine under the country's new mobilization law. Under martial law that was imposed in February 2022, Ukrainian males aged 18 to 60 cannot leave the country. Before the new mobilization law took effect, there were exceptions for dual U.S.-Ukrainian nationals, but now they can be forced to stay. So the U.S. Embassy said, quote, "The U.S. Embassy in Kiev understands that effective June 1st, Ukraine has eliminated a residence abroad exception that previously allowed certain Ukrainian males aged 18 to 60 to depart the country. After this change, U.S. Ukrainian dual citizens, including those who live in the United States, may no longer be able to depart the country," end quote. The embassy said it was, quote, "limited in our ability to influence Ukrainian law, including the application of martial law and the mobilization law to Ukrainian citizens." And the embassy advised dual U.S. Ukrainian nationals that are in the country should shelter in place and obey all local orders, end quote. And they said that for U.S. Ukrainian citizens that are not in Ukraine, they strongly recommend against all travel to Ukraine because you'll probably not be able to leave. So this is part of the mobilization, and we've seen Ukraine is taking some extreme measures to try to fill its ranks as it's suffering these very significant manpower shortages, including they signed a bill into law that will allow them to, I know the parliament passed the bill that will allow them to recruit from prisons, even if including they could recruit murderers under this bill, as long as they've only murdered one person. If they murder two people, that's too many. But you kill one person, you might have a place in the Ukrainian military. So anyway, and other things that they're doing, they're trying to pressure Ukrainian men living abroad to come back by cutting off their consular services and things like that. All right, so the next one here, Zelensky says that Trump would be a loser president if he imposes a peace deal. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Zelensky is worried that if former President Donald Trump is elected in November, then he might make a peace deal with Russia. Trump has previously claimed that he will end the war if reelected, but he has not detailed how he will achieve that. And lately, he has been supporting House Speaker Mike Johnson as he advanced that $61 billion for the proxy war. He basically came out in support of that. But anyway, Zelensky is worried. And in an interview with The Guardian, Zelensky said that if Trump is reelected, he could end U.S. support, weapons, and money and shipments to Ukraine. And Zelensky claimed that Trump would become a loser president for ending the war and would make America very weak. Basically gave the whole spiel that you see from like the neocons in the U.S. Like, oh, if the U.S. doesn't stop Russia and Ukraine, then, you know, it's going to embolden China and everybody's going to invade everybody now. And just this whole tired argument that we have heard for so long now. All right, so the last story here. The Saudis are still slaughtering migrants at the Yemen border. So on Wednesday, the Mixed Migration Center published a report that said Saudi Arabia is still slaughtering African migrants and Yemenis at its border with Yemen, nearly a year after the indiscriminate killings were revealed. So back in July 2023, the Mixed Migration Center, or MMC, issued a report that said Saudi border guards killed nearly 800 Ethiopian migrants and wounded about 1,700 in 2022. Human Rights Watch followed up with a similar report that said the killings could be a crime against humanity. After the reports were released, the New York Times reported that the U.S. was aware of the mass killings on the border since 2022, but kept quiet. And around the time that the U.S. learned of the massacres, the Biden administration was publicly criticizing Riyadh over OPEC's oil cuts. If you remember that, back in the fall of 2022, they were really mad at Saudi Arabia for agreeing to oil production cuts before the elections. So they talked about that publicly, but they learned that they're also gunning down migrants at the border, and this is a country that receives a lot of military support from the U.S. They stayed quiet on that. So this new report says that there's new evidence, quote, that appears to indicate the Saudi border authorities at their southern border with Yemen are continuing to use live weapons to fire indiscriminately at Ethiopians and Yemenis crossing the border irregularly, end quote. So people trying to get into Saudi Arabia for work, mainly. And a lot of these people fled the war in Ethiopia. A ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and Yemen's Houthis has held well since April 2022, But Yemeni media frequently reports Saudi shelling at the border in Yemen's northern Sadr province. And this is something I see quite a bit when I check the Yemeni media sites, is that they'll say, Saudi shelling at the border, 2 killed, some people killed. And, when I first saw that after the ceasefire, I thought maybe that was going to affect things. But apparently this is them killing migrants. And they've bombed migrants in Yemen as well. In January 2022, they bombed a migrant detention center and killed 97 people. I think it was 97. I know it was 90 something, but just a big slaughter there. So this is coming out, again, as the U.S. is apparently preparing to resume offensive weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. You could argue that they never really stopped them, but if they're thinking about resuming offensive weapon sales, that means they're thinking about selling them jets and bombs and things like that. And the U.S. is also pushing this Saudi-Israel normalization deal, which at this point still seems like a pipe dream to me. I know people who think there's a chance of it happening as some big plan for Gaza, but under the terms of that deal, as far as we know, the U.S. would give Saudi Arabia a mutual defense guarantee, would basically commit to going to war for the Saudis if they come under attack. So this is what they're doing at their border with Yemen when the U.S. is planning all these things to increase military support for Saudi Arabia. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from David Vine, the military-industrial complex is killing us all. One from Michael Schellenberger, our spy and intel agencies are out of control. One from Rick Sterling, the future of UNRWA and Hamas in Gaza. One from Joseph Solis Mullen, rescind Netanyahu's invitation about his invite to speak to Congress. And our spotlight is from Blaze Malley. We are the world power. Biden offers defense of U.S. primacy. So please go check all of that out. You could always support this show by sharing it, telling your friends, like, subscribe, and comment. I appreciate everyone who does that. Follow antiwar.com on Instagram. Follow antiwar.com on X. There's a lot of news to get through today. There's going to be a lot more tomorrow, I'm sure. So I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.